Welcome to the 11th annual Khodadad lecture. This is a treasured tradition at the Center for Neuroscience and Society. And it brings us together every year. The sound is coming in and out a little bit. Anyway, it brings us together to think about problem human behavior and how neuroscience might hold a clue to understanding and improving it. The behavior in question was identified by Dr. Khodadad many years ago as something that underlies a lot of crime, cruelty, callous disregard for our fellow man. That is what he calls EPS, excessive pathological selfishness. Now, Dr. Khodadad is a retired neurosurgeon, so his approach to this problem, not surprisingly, was to go through the brain, which was really exciting to us here at Penn because, there's a lot of so-called neuropsychiatry where people try to explain human behavioral problems with the brain, but this construct of selfishness, excessive pathological selfishness, had not really been explored in terms of neurobiology. So, first of all, Garriman and his two sons, who together have a family foundation, Garriman, Victor, and Razi, first of all, they supported research of people at Penn to work on just this problem. Sitting here is Joe Cable, who, with Kristen Redville Horwitz, did a very interesting study on the neurobiology of EPS, specifically a TMS study where they actually showed you could modulate degree of selfishness, of extreme selfishness, by stimulating the right temporal. Is that right? Thereabouts? Okay. So this is exciting not only for the science that it reveals, namely a brain system corresponding to this very destructive psychological state, but because it gives a little clue to possible future treatments. Also, we have here Ted Rodkin, a psychiatrist and behavioral geneticist at medical school here, who developed a mouse assay for selfishness, which nothing like that had ever been done before. It involved using a lot of Reese's peanut butter cups, which mice will kill for, years of videotaping mouse behavior, analyzing it, coding it, etc., and is nearing the completion of the final product of that work. Also, Adrian Rain from our criminology department, who is currently in New Zealand, so we can't have him here, developed a new psychometric measure of selfishness. He published it in 2019, and I just looked it up on Google Scholar. It's been cited 66 times. So there's 66 articles in the scientific literature that have made reference to, presumably because they're using it in their research. So this is a powerful, way of leveraging Penn brain power on selfishness to help the larger research. In any case, in addition to funding this research, for which we remain very grateful, Garriman and his sons Endowed a speaker series, an annual lecture. This is the 11th, designed to inform both neuroscientists and the general public about the problem of excessive pathological selfishness and its brain and genetic bases. This year, we are incredibly lucky to have in our backyard Dr. Rebecca Waller from our Penn psychology department. And one of the things that is really cool about having Becky give this lecture is that she is one of the few people who's actively, intentionally looking for ways to treat this kind of, you might call it dark behavior. And in children, she also has something in common with Garriman, and I assume his family thinks similarly. One of the things that Garriman said to me years ago when he was beginning to establish this field was punishing people is stupid, it's barbaric. People who do terrible, selfish, cruel things need to be treated like patients. They need to be fixed, not just made miserable for the sake of retribution. I just asked Becky about this, and that's her perspective too. So she's really a fitting speaker for us today. I'll just say that she did her doctoral research at Oxford in social and emotional development and in intervention science, which is not as simple as it sounds, trying to figure out if an intervention works. She then went on for postdoctoral work at Michigan, is that name, where she, hello, just yell, where she introduced brain imaging into her work. And then, luckily, 5 or 6 years ago, Penn was able to hire her as an assistant professor. And I will also say that Penn recently promoted her to associate professor with tenure. So we've got her. And so without further ado, I give you Becky Waller and
Thank you.
this title.
I'm going to try and get rid of this that has appeared on our screen, but I don't think is on the Zoom screen. But let me see if I can be clever. Oh, no. Is there a way to get rid of it?
So you can get more. There's like high videos. Yeah, like high little more, and then high floating meeting controls. Bottom and second third. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to come up?
Yeah, there we go.
Done it. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction, Martha. And I'm so honored to be giving this lecture, focusing on what neuroscience can tell us about how to treat callous unemotional traits in children. Am I loud enough for the people at the back? Some people are shaking their heads, some people are nodding. So I should just try and project? Okay. Martha is reminding me, in a former life, I was a high school teacher and had to spend quite a lot of time projecting to children that did not want to hear about science. So I will channel that. And now this is not working. Good.
Update your.
I don't feel like it's fully gone through yet. I think we're waiting on,
I guess it needs some, baby things.
Okay. This was working a minute ago. Let's see. Can we come back over here? There we go. No. Sorry, everybody. Let me see if I can.
Battery there.
Did that already. It was working. There we go.
Oh, good.
I do want to first start by thanking the many, many people who have contributed to the work I'm going to talk about today, some of whom are here, which is wonderful. My fabulous lab, the Eden Lab, as well as many, many collaborators over the years that I've been doing this work, and the funders of the work, including Penn's very own MindCore and NIMH. So, as I said, I'm just really honored to be invited to give this lecture. And I have to admit that this question, what can neuroscience tell us about treating children with callous unemotional traits, is genuinely something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. But I think thinking doesn't do that justice. It's more like worrying about. And I am a known worrier, but like even for me, like a lot of time worrying about it. And Martha mentioned, you know, I've been at Penn for 6 years now. When I first came and gave my job talk and I presented the sort of growing body of work I had done on callous unemotional traits and informing treatments for aggression, this man, who some of you may recognize, who is in fact in New Zealand, Adrian Rain, put his hand up and asked one of the first questions out of the faculty, which was really scary as a person giving a job talk. And he said, but why do you need the brain to answer any of those questions? Why do you need to study the brain to know how to treat children and how to work with families? Can't you just watch or ask? And genuinely, I have not stopped thinking about that question. And so that is why I'm really happy to try and answer it today. Spoiler alert, I probably won't do a great job of answering that question even today. And I think I will leave you with more of a promissory note. And I will highlight where I think we need to go, where I think we've been, how neuroscience has given us a framework, and then how we can build on that, I think, to advance our treatments. So, and of course, I'm really looking forward at the end to hearing all of your thoughts on that and having a discussion about it. So I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. First, I will tell you what callous unemotional traits are, because I think perhaps not everybody is familiar with that construct, and tell you why they matter when we're thinking about extreme pathological selfishness and these patterns of kind of lifelong antisocial behavior and aggression towards other people. I'm going to tell you about parenting and risk for callous unemotional traits and why that matters, both as a question to ask scientifically, but also when we think about intervention and treatment. And then I'm going to end with a focus on how we might weave neuroscience into what we know about treatment already, and how knowledge of neuroscience can help us understand different risk mechanisms and ultimately improve our treatments and give us pointers of where to go next. So before I jump into that, just a background thinking about what psychopathy is. And again, I know many of you will be familiar with this construct. It's been the topic of this lecture, in fact, many times. Psychopathy is a disorder characterized by these extreme personality features, which includes selfishness, as well as harmful antisocial behaviors towards others. And you see here, this is based on Bob Hare's measure, which is the psychopathy checklist, which forms these 2 kind of underlying dimensions that contribute to the psychopathic personality. So this sort of interpersonal affective element of it, as well as this sort of harmful lifestyle behaviors and harmful antisocial behavior. And what I want you to do is hold in your mind this affective facet, which refers to lack of remorse, lack of guilt, and callousness, which I'll come back to shortly. Now, importantly, even though psychopaths comprise less than 1% of the general population, they commit around 40% of crime in the US. And as we know, annual cost of crime exceeds trillions of dollars every year, and violent crime is a really large contributor to that. And that has led Kent Keel, who is a leading researcher in psychopathy, to refer to psychopathy as likely the most expensive mental health disorder. And that doesn't even take into account some of the things that Martha was alluding to, like the really, harm that is caused to victims that we can't really quantify and we can't put a cost on. Victims, communities, families who have to experience this. And I think, really that damage and that harm really does get to the heart of the core of this lecture series, which is understanding and preventing and helping people who suffer from extreme pathological selfishness and aggression, and preventing the long-term consequences of that. So in my lab, that's really what we try and do. We try and go back to the beginning and we say, how does this develop? What are the origins of psychopathy, extreme aggression, violence? How is it that children can develop that across a lifetime? And we study risk factors at the individual level, including genetics, brain function and structure, physiology, all of which I will touch on today. And we also think about environmental risk, because it's really not possible to separate those things. And we think about how those interact, and knowing about the interactions actually is going to help us ultimately make our treatments and make our interventions more effective. So starting with callous unemotional traits. As I highlighted earlier, this affective facet of psychopathy includes items really centered on this kind of emotional coldness, lack of remorse, lack of guilt, shallow affect towards others, and really just uncaring about other people. And the callous unemotional traits, or the CU traits construct, was directly derived as a developmental kind of extension downwards from that facet. And it aimed at really trying to understand and identify children who also might be at risk for these more severe outcomes. As you see in adults who have these traits, can we kind of bring it earlier in development? And a lot of this work was developed and led by Paul Frick. And he, going back about 3 decades now. And here are some items from a measure that he developed called the Inventory of Callous Unemotional Traits, the ICU, that again really exemplify this idea of a child who is really uncaring, who lacks empathy, and has difficulties distinguishing between right and wrong. And CU traits were actually added to the DSM-5, so the way in which clinicians give children diagnoses, in 2013 as a specifier for conduct disorder. So a child will receive a diagnosis of conduct disorder with or without co-occurring callous unemotional traits. And these are the specific indicators in the DSM-5. And what you see, and I think this is really important, is that these items used to assess callous unemotional traits don't have anything to do with aggression. They don't actually have anything to do with violence or antisocial behavior. There's no content overlap with this other criterion variable that you're caring about predicting. You're identifying a distinct subgroup of children, and I'll talk in a minute about how that does portend risk for aggression and violence. And of course, having callous unemotional traits is not the only risk for aggression and violence across the lifespan, but it's what I'm going to talk about today. So like the presence of those psychopathic personality traits, we also see that callous unemotional traits in adolescence designate individuals who are at very high risk for severe antisocial outcomes. I'm only going to talk about my own work, but many people have done this, so it's not just me. I'm going to highlight 2 studies we did in adolescence. One is 1,400 adjudicated adolescents who were seen before a judge and then followed for 8 years every year with annual assessments of callous unemotional traits, and then followed up at age 24. And we used latent profile analysis to identify this group in turquoise who had high stable callous unemotional traits across that period. That group, relative to the moderate and the low CU traits group, had the highest rates of violent recidivism, drug-related offenses, and violent drug offenses at 24. Everyone in this sample had a history of being arrested, but it was the CU traits that allowed us to understand who was at the highest risk. We did another study. This is data from the Pittsburgh Youth Study, so boys who again followed in a longitudinal cohort. Here we see that children with higher conduct problems at age 10 had the highest levels of adult psychopathy at 24, when they also had high callous unemotional traits. So again, evidence that knowing about CU traits, at least in older children, is telling us something about who is at risk for these severe outcomes across time. And I did add, actually, not just my own work, this is a meta-analysis from Abby Marsh's group, in 2020, where they just looked at scores on that measure developed by Paul Frick, the Inventory of Callous Unemotional Traits. And I just want to orient you to a couple of things. So higher scores, total scores on that are related to total psychopathy scores in specifically to higher affective facet scores, as you would predict, given the history of the development of the construct. And then higher externalizing outcomes, so aggression, rule breaking, violence, but not strongly related to internalizing outcomes. Okay. What we do know, though, is that the development of antisocial behavior and disruptive behavior has its roots really early in childhood. We know, I know, because I have a 2-year-old, that problem behavior starts early, and particularly during the twos, the terrible twos, it can be really hard to manage. And so if we know that, and we know that CU traits tell us something really important about risk for violence and psychopathy, how early can we go in terms of detecting callous unemotional traits? And before you start worrying that I'm about to measure child psychopaths, I promise you I would never ever refer to a child as a psychopath. I'm going to talk about how we think about this from both a clinical perspective, but also really informed by the developmental literature. So just wearing a developmental hat for a second, we know actually a lot about the early emergence of things that have gone awry when children have callous unemotional traits. We know that early signs of empathy, guilt, and caring behavior are detectable even in the first year of life. So here is a girl who is under the age of 1, responding, getting emotionally there's contagion of emotion from a picture book. Okay, so watch her emotion. If it works, there we go. Watch her face. Mom is saying, look, this one's happy and this one's sad. We also see that children actually really can be very instrumentally helpful, and often being instrumentally helpful is easier for young children than knowing how to respond emotionally to another person. So here is a toddler helping her dad with a broken leg. And then here's an example of a child showing emotional support to another child. I hope the sound works on this one, but let's see.
You okay? Yeah. You hug? You'd hug.
So we know from the developmental literature that these things emerge early in life, and by extension, therefore, there's going to be variability in that. And, again, to get to the roots of callous unemotional traits, I think we need to be guided in a bottom-up way by that developmental literature. And, that's really consistent with the developmental psychopathology framework, work led by Dante Cicchetti, this idea of kind of bridging an outcome that we care about clinically, but thinking about how normal developmental processes might have gone awry. And I myself, actually, throughout my training, particularly when I was at Oxford, I worked with Gordon Claridge. This was really woven into the whole way I've always thought about disorders. And this is a quote that appeared in Gordon Claridge's book that we read as an undergrad. The development of pathological function in a system is quite consistent with its usual performance. This idea that how the same underlying architecture, including neural architecture, could give rise both to adaptive and maladaptive functioning. In this case, perhaps, extreme pathological selfishness at one end and altruism and caring at the other end. And I think, again, I really try and hold on to this framework when I'm thinking about these things clinically as well. So building on that idea, a large part of my work has really focused on trying to understand the origins of callous unemotional traits and when we can first detect it. So we've actually shown across numerous independent samples that we can measure CU traits from about age 3 onwards. This is one example. So we give parents these 17 items, which include items to do with attention deficit problems, oppositional problems, and callous unemotional traits. And we see that when we do factor analysis of these items, that they load onto separate factors. So what that means is parents are not seeing these 17 things as just indicating one kind of overarching problem behavior, but they are able to differentiate between these different early markers of the way that behavior problems can manifest. And we've replicated this across many different studies now, again, showing that at least in the way parents report, they are viewing these things as distinct. And I'll tell you in a minute how they might be seen as important. So we've shown to support this factor structure that these factors have construct validity. They kind of map onto criterion variables in a way that we would expect. So this is data from Sherry Olson's Michigan longitudinal study of 243-year-olds who had been oversampled for having aggression and behavior problems. We showed, for example, that oppositional factor mapped onto children showing more anger and frustration, that the attention deficit factor was related to lower observed effortful control in the lab, as well as less attentional focusing across different informants. And then importantly, we showed that callous unemotional traits factor was uniquely related to lower moral regulation, lower empathy, and lower guilt across different informants. And when we think back to where I started thinking about prediction of risk, it was the CU traits factor specifically at age 3 that predicted who teachers were reporting at age 6 in the classroom had the highest levels of externalizing problems, as well as the highest levels of proactive aggression. So the type of aggression that is planned and premeditated. So I think, together what that's saying is even in early childhood, this construct has meaning. It maps onto variables in a way we would expect, and it's signaling who is at greater risk for some of these really costly outcomes that we would like to try and prevent and intervene on early. I added this into my talk today because I never get to talk about this study, but I was sort of thinking that this group might appreciate this work. Something that had always sort of worried me, and again, I worry about a lot of things, as you can tell. I wanted to try and really place the CU traits construct in a sort of nomological network, and I want to give you this kind of broader sense of the construct. We did a meta-analysis in 2020 asking what is the association between callous unemotional traits and empathy and guilt and prosociality. And it's a sort of strangely, it's a sort of question where you think, why are you even asking that question? Of course they're associated. That's where the construct came from. And we did justify why we did it. Let me show you the findings. So we did find, as you would expect, given the origins of the construct, that these things were pretty moderately related over time, with the strongest association between prosocial behavior, lower prosocial behavior, and CU traits, but not actually, the associations weren't as high as you would think. And given, again, the origin of the construct. So clearly there's quite a lot of variance in CU traits that's not fully accounted for by having being less empathic or showing less prosocial behavior. And I think, and I've talked a lot with Adrian about this and Marty Seligman about this, how items are phrased and worded. Are we talking about the presence of a bad thing, being mean, being selfish, or the absence of something like empathy or caring behavior, and how parents view that? And so this is just something I would want to come back to in my own work, thinking about how are we measuring these things and how are they viewed? Because I think it really ultimately will matter when we start to think about making, really being able to talk about treatment-related change. Where are we expecting to see that change? And 2 other findings from this were really interesting, by the way. First of all, we found that lower cognitive empathy specifically was more strongly related to higher callous unemotional traits in younger children, perhaps suggesting that as children with CU traits get older, they're able to leverage some kind of compensatory cognitive mechanisms that might overcome some of their perhaps core emotional empathy difficulties. And that was actually borne out when we looked at the difference in affective versus cognitive empathy scores. So we see that in older children, there's a greater discrepancy in the levels of affective versus cognitive empathy. So again, despite that kind of cognitive compensation, these older children with CU traits are still kind of having difficulties with the emotional portion of it and the emotional resonance. And I'm going to come back to that later when we're thinking specifically about the brain and about neural correlates and emotional resonation with other people. So what's the takeaway here? By the way, this is an AI-generated image of a callous, mean, selfish boy, black and white. I can't remember what else I took, but I wasted way too long of my day trying to get a cool image of it. Anyone is welcome to it if they would like it. What is the takeaway here? I hope I've convinced you that measuring this construct is important, that it helps us potentially identify children who are at risk for these more harmful outcomes across the lifespan. What I'm really now realizing, though, is that callous-unemotional traits are very siloed. It's something that we in the research community spend a lot of time writing and thinking about. In the translation to treatment and clinical settings, it's so lacking. We're really missing that bridge. And I think there's one really good reason for that, which is the fear around the stigma associated with this, which I think is a really, really justified fear. This is a construct that came from adult psychopathy. You can imagine why pediatricians, social workers, teachers are really reluctant to use this terminology and to worry about labeling kids in ways that potentially are harmful. I think the other side of that is one that is also really important. And I will say we have, as a field, really tried hard not to talk about child psychopathy. We're really careful in our language, maybe actually to a fault. I want to highlight this point, which is made by Abby Marsh started this foundation called Psychopathy Is, the euphemism treadmill, that we're trying to avoid stigma to the point where we actually are doing families a disservice. These are some ex-posts from a parent advocate of a child with extremely severe conduct disorder, who's saying this is actually unhelpful. It's a word. We as parents need a label. We need something where we can say, this is the bounds of what it is. It's known, and we can use that to then, to go from there in terms of treatment. And I think that these are really difficult but important questions that we need to be asking as a field. How do we get from this research environment into practice, and how do we do it in ways that avoid stigma but also help families get the treatment that they need? And I'll come back to some of this at the end. I will say that we are currently doing a study using items collected in early childhood and using machine learning to see which items could be used as a screener, if we were going to get to that point, to predict that predict later callous-unemotional traits. It's led by a postdoc in my lab, Emily Perkins. So watch this space. But as I sort of alluded to, right now, okay, we don't have great words for it. And even if we did, what would we tell parents? What are we saying to parents of children who have callous-unemotional traits? What do I do then? How can you help? And that's, to start with, where I think parenting does come in. And the first question is whether parenting matters to callous-unemotional traits. Of course, we know that parents are the largest socializing influence on children, particularly in the first few years of life. We also know from decades of work that parenting, things like harsh parenting, lack of involvement, those are really big predictors of the development of aggression and antisocial behavior. And of course, that work has informed gold standard parenting-based interventions for antisocial behavior and childhood behavior problems. And that's still, to this day, our frontline treatment for behavior problems are parenting interventions. When I first started my PhD, that was not how people were thinking about callous-unemotional traits. And these are quotes from papers I was reading as a graduate student, describing children with callous-unemotional traits as being less amenable to treatment, even unresponsive to parenting, hard to treat, and that there was biogenetic influences, and therefore parenting interventions would not work. Now, as I said at the beginning, I had just come from being my first career as a high school teacher, working with lots of kids with behavior problems, and I really wasn't willing to accept that there was this whole group of children that we were just going to say, it doesn't matter, they're unresponsive to the environment. And I wanted to know, does parenting matter? Can we get any traction here? And so again, I've really tried to dig into this question, try and understand how parenting might matter. And so we've, in numerous studies, including reviews, have shown that within observational studies, harsh parenting, as well as a lack of warmth, a lack of affection, are both related to increases in callous-unemotional traits across childhood. And I think that that's really encouraging and helps to emphasize that parenting does matter and could therefore encourage us in terms of intervention. But there's an issue with observational studies of biologically related dyads. And by the way, this is not a problem that is specific to callous-unemotional traits. It applies to whatever your phenotype of interest is if you're looking at parents or within families. And that is the problem that we cannot ever truly separate genetic and shared environmental influences to really know, is this that parenting is related to the callous-unemotional traits, or is it some function of shared genetic risk? So an example might be a parent who is, relatively low on warmth themselves, has a child who shares some of that genetic propensity, and therefore early on is sort of seems less warm, and that you can imagine how those processes unfold over time. So to address that issue, we've used a number of different genetically informed designs to really try and tease apart the heritable and environmental influences on CU traits. And one way is to use an adoption design. So the logic here is you can identify a genetic main effect, an association between some characteristic of the parent that is related to child characteristics. And then you can study parenting of the adoptive parents, and that would be more of a true environmental effect of parenting, since they are genetically not related. And it also gives you an opportunity to examine a sort of special type of gene bioenvironment interaction, not the type when you think about candidate genes, but the extent to which adoptive parenting can buffer this heritable pathway. So we applied that logic using an amazing study, the Early Growth and Development Study, the EGADS, which is a linked study of 561 biological parents, adoptive parents, and their adopted children, who were all adopted on average within 2 days of birth. So really minimizing the shared environment with the biological parent, excluding, of course, the prenatal environment, which we cannot, in this study at least, do anything about. And what we found, in line with evidence that CU traits are heritable, is we found this unique pathway between higher levels of antisocial behavior in biological mothers assessed when children were 9 months. They weren't living with they were already adopted at that point, which was related specifically to higher callous-unemotional traits in the children at 27 months. Thankfully, that was not the end of the story, because that would have been a really, really depressing paper to publish. We did also find that higher levels of observed warmth in adoptive parents were related to lower callous-unemotional traits and lower oppositional defiant behaviors in the adopted children. And we found evidence for this gene bioenvironment interaction. And what that looked like was that when adoptive parents were low on warmth, we saw that heritable pathway. We saw that more antisocial behavior of biological parents was related to more CU traits in the adopted children. But when adoptive parents were higher on observed warmth, that pathway, that heritable pathway, was buffered. We saw this kind of buffering effect of the genetic risk. Now, that study does not rule out the possibility that parenting represents a reaction to some inherited characteristics of the child, even in the absence of shared genetic risk. So what we would call an evocative effect of the sort of genetic predisposition of the children. So again, we wanted to test that question and try and understand whether that existed. And again, using data from EGADS, we showed evidence that higher CU traits at 27 months did in fact predict increases in harshness in adoptive parents over time, perhaps signifying this kind of evocative effect. These children perhaps are harder to parent, they're less responsive to typical parenting strategies. But at the same time, higher harshness of the adoptive parents also predicted increases in CU traits over time. So again, even when we take into account these heritable components, we still see this true environmental effect of parenting. I'm going to skip quickly through these next two studies, which were also genetically informed, in this case using twin designs, showing in monozygotic twins, this is a twin differences design, the twin who experienced higher levels of harshness had higher levels of both aggression and CU traits. The twin who experienced lower warmth specifically had higher callous-unemotional traits. And then in the ABCD study, we looked at the twin subsample and showed first there were heritable influences on CU traits, as we would expect, but we also found that higher levels of parental warmth and acceptance moderated the degree to which the non-shared environment influenced callous-unemotional traits in children. At high levels of warmth, you saw less of that etiological influence on CU traits. Again, telling us that even within these genetically informed designs, where we're kind of able to separate out shared environment, shared genetics, we still see this influence of parenting. So when we put all those pieces together, we also have to consider most of the time we're working with biological families who typically, who may all share this heritable risk. But I think what we can say is that clearly harsher parenting matters in terms of increasing risk, and also increasing warmth, increasing involvement can minimize that risk. And I think that gives us really clear targets for interventions and real hope for interventions. And the fact that we've done that in these genetically informed designs means that we can rule out this being entirely due to, at least, shared temperament characteristics that children and parents might share, and we can really point to the parenting as a place where we could make a difference. And that is borne out in a meta-analysis that we published recently from 60 treatment studies and over 9,000 participants, where we found similar treatment-related reductions in children with high and low CU traits. And importantly, we found that treatments that had a parenting component, that targeted parenting practices, were directly effective in reducing CU traits. So again, that to me says regardless of what the child is bringing to the table in terms of these traits, we still need to keep parenting interventions as our frontline approach. And we know from, and this is work from my doctoral supervisor, from a network meta-analysis, we know that the most effective components for parenting interventions when it comes to reducing behavioral problems center on teaching parents really strong behavior management skills. And again, I think our work shows that should still be the case if the child has callous-unemotional traits. We shouldn't be doing something, initially at least, something different. But also, we've seen that parental warmth might be particularly important, and I want to highlight ongoing work that has added modules to traditional parenting interventions to really focus on how do you increase warmth, how do you increase the positive emotional interactions of parents and children. This is an adaptation to parent-child interaction therapy done by Eva Kimonis in Australia, and you see big effect sizes in terms of reducing callous-unemotional traits and child aggression. Just as a side note, when we're thinking both about going in and tailoring for CU traits, I think we also need to think about broadening out and how we make treatments more accessible to everyone, which I think is an issue, because these are very limited in terms of who has access to these treatments even now. We have an ongoing study called the Prenatal to Preschool study, and we've been assessing parenting online, both with reliability and with validity. And I do think that this is really an important step in terms of thinking about how we can increase access in terms of delivering some of these treatments. And I'll come back to that at the end. So if these interventions are so effective, and if we want to move the needle on violence and aggression, you could ask, well, why aren't we just trying to do more parenting interventions? And why aren't parenting interventions really universal and available at scale in the population? And I am not going to try and answer that question. We can come back to it at the end. But I am going to say, where is neuroscience in all of this? How does that fit into this story? And more importantly, perhaps, how could neuroscience make these treatments that I have argued very passionately are effective? How could neuroscience help us make those even more effective? So I think there's the issues around access, but I think we know we have this really solid starting point. How can we make that even more successful? How can we make it even more effective? I think one way to answer that question is the simple fact that we are even talking about adapting treatments or evaluating children on the basis of whether or not they have CU traits. Neuroscience evidence was foundational in kind of supporting that literature and helping to differentiate between children on the basis of CU traits. This was, I have to confess, before I was in this field, before I even really knew what it would be to be an academic. But definitely, I think if it were not for neuroscience, we would not have the evidence base that led to the addition of CU traits into the DSM-5, and this sort of subfield was born. And I think that is really important, because we're looking at children, we're saying, okay, we start with this universal intervention, but we're going to need something different. And child A needs X, and child B needs Y. And I think neuroscience has helped us get to that point. But I also think we're really at the beginning of trying to think about taking what we know from neuroscience and applying that to mechanistically informed treatments. And that's where I want to go in the last part of this talk. How can we leverage neuroscience to identify these mechanisms that can then lead to really tailored treatments and really tailored interventions? And I think that, aside from parenting, it definitely is the case that CU traits are heritable. It's definitely the case these kids are bringing something to the table. I will add then that perhaps no more heritable than any other personality or psychiatric disorder. In fact, quite a lot less heritable than some psychiatric disorders. But that heritability is associated when in these kids with an interpersonal and an affective style that really shapes these children's environments and their social relationships in ways that I think really exacerbate their risk. We've shown, for example, that children high in CU traits, you see these reductions in parental warmth over time. I already showed you the finding of increases in harshness over time. We've also seen these children have reductions in friendship quality over many years and deteriorations in their relationships with their teachers over time. So they are learning over and over and over again from the social input that they're getting, I am not liked, I'm rejected, and people react in a negative way to me. And I think that, again, we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about, therefore, how do they present in treatment and how do they present clinically, and how therapists are responding to them in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see for a child with anxiety, for a child who's extremely traumatized. They would elicit a very different reaction from their social environment. And that plays into, I think, this disorder in ways that makes these children seem unlikable and less treatable. But they are still children, and they definitely still deserve treatment, and the best treatment that we can offer them. So I mentioned the treatment meta-analysis earlier. Some of the more eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that I skipped over, oh no, my animation failed. A really important part of this graph, which should be a huge red line right here, showing this big difference. I skipped over it. Some of you spotted it. I said, oh, they show comparable rates of reduction in behavior problems following treatment. But they still end treatment, well, they start treatment and end treatment with more severe behavior problems. And this is where I think the need for these mechanistically targeted interventions comes in, and where we really need to understand the specific characteristics of these children so we can close that gap and really bring them in line with their low CU peers. And so in thinking about the core of what those inherited difficulties might be, my lab has really drawn on a wide literature. That includes psychometric models of personality, things like the interpersonal circumplex. I've already talked about some of the classic developmental work that we're informed by. Models of psychopathy, like Chris Patrick's triarchic model, James Blair's early work on the violence inhibition mechanism, and then really foundational seminal work on both the biological basis of social bonding, as well as the neural underpinnings of kind of affiliative social behavior and aversion processing, or processing of threat cues. And we've drawn on that to propose this model, the sensitivity to threat and affiliative reward, or STAR model, which characterizes transdiagnostic risk for psychopathology along two dimensions: threat sensitivity and affiliation. And we're specifically proposing CU traits here at the nexus of both low threat sensitivity and low affiliation. So threat sensitivity being this, sort of low threat sensitivity being kind of reduced responsiveness to negative cues in the environment that should otherwise signal the need to change behavior. That could be others' distress, fear, punishment, an angry parent or an angry teacher. And that was well accepted in the literature and draws from, really classic work in adult psychopathy. But what we argue is that doesn't fully take into account and fully explain this phenotype. And to do that, you need to think about some of these social and motivational difficulties of these children. And the fact that they also seem to be low on affiliation. They aren't motivated by having social closeness with others. And so we have now really tried to sort of think about how we can characterize and understand these different dimensions. And I think neuroscientific evidence has been really important in terms of informing that STAR model. Many studies, including from our own lab, but I'm not showing our work here, have shown that CU traits in children are associated with reduced amygdala reactivity to both fearful faces of others as well as negative images that should be aversive. And in fact, in one really nice study from Abby Marsh's group, you see that low amygdala reactivity to fearful faces mediated the link between callous-unemotional traits and more proactive aggression. So again, that aggression that is premeditated and planned. So again, the idea that children are not showing this kind of expected arousal in response to this aversive cue that they're getting, and that's sort of potentially what's allowing them to then proactively cause aggression against others. To date, at least, one neuroimaging study speaks to the affiliation portion of the model, which is work from 2017 from O'Neill's, showing that when children high on CU traits, comparing basically how children with high versus low on CU traits respond to laughter cues. And you see reduced anterior insular reactivity in the kids with CU traits when they hear laughter cues during an fMRI paradigm. So that was gave us some kind of foundational evidence for the STAR model. In our own work, we started testing some of these questions behaviorally, and we've developed a measure to assess the STAR dimensions, as well as used other existing studies. This is actually, this is data from using the ABCD study led by a postdoc in my lab, showing that the combination of low threat sensitivity and low affiliation, the sort of pinky purple line, is associated with the highest level of CU traits. And we've shown this across informants and across time, as well as in multiple independent studies, including the other person pictured who was a visiting student from Spain. We've also thought about using this in terms of observational measures. And so through multiple different studies, trying to observe children in the lab, showing that reduced sensitivity to novelty or threat cues, as well as observations of kind of less social affiliations, less social engagement with others, are also related to increases in CU traits. So I want to give you one example here of an affiliation-based task. So this is, children did several different tasks, but I'm just going to talk about one. So here the child has to take a bird out of a birdhouse. This is 2-year-old children, but it's really a hard thing for a 2-year-old to do. And so the experimenter models, here's how you get the bird out. You pull this rod out, and then you have to pull the door up and lift it and push it back. And that's a sort of functional action that the experimenter does. Then the experimenter does this completely arbitrary thing that is supposed to create like a nice social bonding moment, where they take the bird and they go teep, 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 and they kind of dance the bird across the table. And the child watches the experimenter do this a couple of times. They do a couple of other tasks, and then the child has a turn. And we coded how many and which of the behaviors does the child imitate. And what we found was that the number of functional or instrumental behaviors that the child copies at age 2 was completely unrelated to either oppositional defiant behavior or CU traits at age 3. However, children who copied fewer of those arbitrary sort of social bonding actions had higher levels of CU traits 1 year later. I'll add as well that we found evidence for the heritability of these early risk markers. So we've had report measures, observational measures, and I just want to touch on the heritability of these. So this is again using data from the adoption study, the EGADS. So heritable pathways in the absence of a shared environment, since children are not being raised by their biological parents. And we found evidence for this fearlessness pathway. So this was observations of children in the lab being shown a sort of threatening cue. Lower levels, of self-reported threat sensitivity of biological mothers were related to less observed threat sensitivity in the lab of the adopted children, which in turn was related to higher CU traits in children at 27 months. In terms of affiliation, we found this direct pathway, again, from lower affiliation in biological mothers to higher CU traits in adopted children, as well as this link between fewer verbal and physical displays of affection from adopted children towards their adoptive parent, predicting increases in CU traits at 27 months. Now, I think all of that's encouraging. I think it sort of speaks to there being some evidence for this idea that CU traits are kind of at this nexus of both low threat sensitivity and low affiliation. But self-report measures are not always feasible, certainly not with younger children. Observational measures like the one I just described to you, the coding of children's behavior, are very time-consuming and very hard to operationalize when you cannot run lab visits, like you're 1 year into your tenure clock and a once-in-a-generation pandemic shuts everything down. So we spent some time in 2020 and 2021 thinking about ways we could assess these things through computer tasks that could initially be done online, with the hope that one day we would be back in the lab and that we could do them in the lab and combine them with assessments of physiology and attention and other biologically based metrics. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So we know that the children with CU traits and adults with psychopathy have difficulties recognizing facial expressions of emotion, particularly, as I've alluded to, distress-based cues like sadness and fear. And again, I think that's sort of consistent with this idea of low threat sensitivity. However, I think facial expressions can often conflate and therefore reflect sort of both social threat and affiliative need. And I think that actually undermines our ability to test the hypotheses of the STAR model. And Abby Marsh actually goes a little bit further, despite her many papers on threat processing and fear faces, arguing this year, I think this paper came out, that fear actually is sort of indexing vulnerability and therefore potentially evoking affiliation and not signaling threat necessarily. So to kind of separately be able to really tease apart children's ability to both recognize and respond to cues of threat versus affiliation, we really thought hard about tasks that did a better job of separating those in terms of the emotion cues that were being elicited, and really try and isolate the sort of emotional resonance difficulties that we see playing out when we ask about the empathy in these children, and do it in a way that does not rely on faces. So we started with laughter in adults, laughter which typically we might think of as being a universal cue of affiliation and social bonding. So that might sound a bit like this. But laughter is not always friendly. So sometimes laughter can also be kind of mean and socially threatening, a bit like this. So I don't know whether to be concerned that you're all laughing at that. Okay. So in adults, and you'll see why in a minute, we showed that actually people are really good at differentiating between the mean and the friendly laughter. And they get better at doing it as the intensity of the laughter increases. But we found actually that people high on psychopathy, and they want to join in more as the nice laughter gets more intense, and join in less with the mean laughter as it gets more intense. But that was not true for people high on psychopathic traits. Here we found overall that people high on psychopathic traits were just generally worse at differentiating between these two different types of social cues, and actually wanted to join in more as the mean laughter got more intense. And I think that gives us some clues into perhaps some of the social bonding difficulties that we see in adults with psychopathy. And now we're doing this in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. We've adapted the task. This is hot off the press and we're still collecting data. But we have really tried to think about how can we do this in young kids? So we've adapted the task. Children see these different faces and they have to match the laughter to the mean laughing face, the neutral face, or the very happy smiley face. And I can speak to the design issues we've had if anyone is curious. And we say first of all, who is laughing, which is the recognition question. And children are pretty good at recognizing who is laughing. They're better at recognizing the mean laugher, I should say. And then to get at that kind of social bonding resonance piece of the story, we ask simply, do you want to play with this person? Yes or no? And again, children are more likely to say they want to play with the friendly laugher and less likely to say they want to play with the mean laugher. But we see differences as a function of CU traits. So children who are higher on CU traits are less good at picking up on the mean laughter cues. Actually, what I think these results show, given the regions, my brain is completely frozen. The things around the lines is that children low on CU traits are super sensitive to the mean laughers, and the high CU kids are just not as good as it. But I think that this is giving us really interesting insights, at least into, again, some of the difficulties that these children might be having when they're in social interactions with others. In addition to laughter, we've also used music to evaluate emotion recognition and emotion resonance. So feeling and connecting with emotion, which I think music is a really powerful way of getting at that. Again, in the absence of facial cues of emotion. And the inspiration for this study came from this really classic quote from the 1960s, describing psychopaths as knowing the words, but not the music, being able to sort of say something, but not feeling it. And again, we've shown that individuals, this is in adults again, that individuals higher in psychopathic traits are less good at recognizing music overall, particularly for fearful music, the red line, you see that kind of dropping off as you get high levels of psychopathic traits. And here's an example of that fearful music. No, in a second. They also are less likely to, so they have to first recognize the emotion, and then they're asked, how does this music make you feel? They are also less good at saying the music makes them afraid if it's fearful music like this. And in fact, I don't have a graph for this, but individuals higher on psychopathy are more likely overall to say the music makes them angry, which is interesting, I think. We also looked at the structural features of the music, specifically key, whether it's in a major or minor key, or the tempo of the music. And we found that participants higher on psychopathic traits were just generally worse and rather sort of immune to the tempo of the music. So generally people were sort of helped by the slower speed of music in terms of their accuracy, but not if you were high on psychopathic traits, regardless of the emotion conveyed by the music. It tended to be the sad music or the neutral music that was true for, but across emotion type, psychopathic traits was associated with kind of less sensitivity to this slow tempo, like this. And I also thought it was interesting, and perhaps you're thinking this as you're listening to me, that people high on psychopathic traits didn't report that they listened to music any less than those low on psychopathic traits, but when asked what feelings, what emotions do you feel when you're listening to music, reported fewer feelings. So again, I think speaking to that resonance piece of it. And of course, there's a huge literature on the neuroscience of music, and but there is not any literature on the neuroscience of music and psychopathy. And I think that that's a really hugely missed opportunity to think about in terms of integrating them. And this is these are not my data. These are data from a meta-analysis from Kolsch that identified 10 regions across studies activated during music listening. But again, we're talking now in adults with psychopathy about people who do not resonate with the emotions of others. And here we have this really nice paradigm, I think, for trying to understand that mechanistically. And again, when we think about how difficult it is to, think about functional tasks for children in the scanner, here is potentially a passive task where we could, again, leverage music as a really nice way of evoking emotion that I think could be really powerful. So if that sounds appealing to you and you want to do some science with me on it, let me know. Ted. I promise that slide wasn't just in there for you, because I didn't know you were coming. So we're also doing this in young kids, by the way. We've adapted it again for younger age samples. So in 5 and 6 year olds, we showed again that children are above chance in recognizing emotion in music, and that children who are lower on empathy down here are much worse at recognizing sad music, which I think is interesting, and resonating with that sad music. And then in our 3 and 4 and 5 year olds, again, this is like still ongoing data collection. And by the way, this work is being led by an undergrad in my lab who is phenomenal. We see that actually 3-year-olds cannot do this task. They are not getting the music correctly above chance. 4 and 5 year olds are better at it. Children higher on CU traits are just worse at recognizing music across the board. And again, I'm going to be curious to see what we end up with once we have finished data collection there. But again, I think music being a really nice paradigm for trying to get at the emotion resonance difficulties. So now I just want to end by thinking about the integration of all of these things and how I think that could ultimately inform treatment. And that is something that we're doing right now. Thankfully, we are back in the lab and we have some R01 funding to kind of put all of those pieces together. So we're collecting multi-method psychophysiological data from 3 and 4 year olds who will then follow up with again when they're 5 and 6. And we have a host of the behavioral tasks I've mentioned, the computer tasks I've mentioned, really trying to evaluate how children are recognizing and responding to numerous cues of both threat, social threat and non-social threat, as well as affiliation, and combining kind of physiological data, collection and eye tracking at various points to really understand that, and also having the parents do the same thing. That's my daughter being a pilot subject. And here's an example of one of the tasks. Again, this is my daughter. You can see she has an EDA on her left hand. She also has 11 electrodes to capture physiology. And this is eye tracking as she's watching the scene from The Lion King. Electrodermal activity. Yeah. This is the scene from The Lion King where, sorry, has anyone not seen The Lion King? I'm going to ruin it for you. Their dad dies. And it's really sad. And the music is really sad. So again, we're having kids do that and watch not just that, but various other things. So back to today. God, imagine if I had ruined The Lion King for somebody. I would feel so bad. To the question at hand. It's preliminary, I think, in answer to the question. It's promissory. But I do think that some of this work holds promise for integrating neuroscience into how we treat CU traits. And I want to think about a few ways that we can do that, including things that we're doing in the lab, but many people are doing this work. So I think a different title could have been the need, the need to embed biology within our behavioral and our psychosocial interventions. So here are some things that we've come up with in the lab and that we're thinking about actually in a paper that we're working on right now, led by Emily Perkins, wonderful postdoc. And one way I think is in terms of measurement, including measures of CU traits. And as I alluded to with reference to that meta-analysis, we're so reliant on a one snapshot moment where we ask a parent about a child's temperament and behavior. And we know these things are subject to so many different influences, and none of the measures that we have of CU traits are very perfect, and lots of them have deep psychometric issues themselves. And so if we really are going to talk about screening and identifying children at risk for these things, we really have to have confidence in our measures. And I think biology can help us there. And Emily has written about this really beautifully, thinking about how you can use biology, in this case, EEG, to refine questionnaires over time by sort of adding or subtracting items to maximize correlations with a biological variable that itself could become either a target of treatment or could be kind of combined into a multi-method assessment. Another example, again, this is not work from my lab, but using biology to identify somebody who is at greater risk now. So when we think about prioritizing interventions, and we think about prioritizing limited resources, and we have to choose who's going to get services first, using the biology to guide that. So again, this is an EEG study identifying children who had a particular P300 response, who then went on to have more severe ADHD symptoms. That would have been who we should have targeted with the treatment. And again, a paper that just came out that Adrian Rain is an author on, looking at resting heart rate as a predictor across a childhood and into adulthood of antisocial behavior, and including via traits related to fearlessness. So again, I don't think we want to be saying this child has this heart rate, therefore we need to treat them now, but I think we can be thinking about how we can use these biological measures to make our assessments more reliable and target our treatments where they're needed. I also think neuroscience gives us insight into maybe why some children might present more challenge when it comes to treatment. And Emily and I were just talking about that. I think none of us thinks that the CU traits construct is a perfect construct. I don't even like the words that we use for it, but I don't think anyone would deny that that is a real phenomena. When you meet one of these kids, and it may be that we just need better words and better ways of identifying that. And again, neuroscience can help us with that, give us precision about who might present, who might need a different treatment. And this is data from James Blair's group showing that amygdala hyperreactivity to fear was observed in boys who then went on to be treatment resistant for a standard parenting intervention. So that, again, could help guide a different treatment from the outset, or a treatment with an add-on from the outset to try and bring about greater clinical change. It also gives us insight into biological targets of treatment. Again, this is work now in adults, a recent study from 2023, a double-blind crossover study where administration of oxytocin basically eliminated the fear the difficulties in recognizing fear among adults with psychopathy. So again, there is potential there again to sort of think about how these could be add-ons, perhaps in conjunction with a parenting intervention to really bring about change. And then this study came out in 2024, so we're in the future. It's in affective science, using functional magnetic resonance imaging neurofeedback live in the moment to give sort of insight into change for children with disruptive behavior disorders and callous-unemotional traits. I found this study at 3 p.m. today. I haven't read it, but I'm pointing to it as a really exciting example from the future that we could come to. And then I do think that there's really something important about education, and particularly biopsychoeducation. So many parenting interventions have this kind of psychoeducation component to them, where the therapist helps to kind of scaffold and motivate the parent by giving them the basics of social learning theory, gives them insight into why children might behave the way they do. I think we could add a bio element to that. And I think we see that in some of these popular books that are in the press. I was actually quite horrified that my husband, who is, a dentist, decided to buy this book, but apparently it's been very helpful. And he talks about my children's upstairs brain and their downstairs brain. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to read that book, but I'm glad it's helping you. But I do think that there is something to that, helping parents understand the sort of biological element to some of these behaviors, which again could help change their attributions. And where we do have evidence is that by changing attributions and beliefs that parents hold about behavior, that can actually help motivate and change their parenting strategies, which again can have a positive effect on aggression and callous-unemotional traits. And I'm going to end by thinking, I guess, beyond just neuroscience. And I'm really curious about, these are things I think that this group think a lot about, which is both neuroscience kind of from the inside and from the outside. This is a representation of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model, which I think about a lot, and I think about where does neuroscience fit in here. A paper came out just this year showing the huge economic costs of early conduct problems. And I would counter that with this study where we see that this looked at service uptake of adults and predictors prospectively assessed of service uptake, so medical, legal service uptake. And you see that parental sensitivity in early childhood is related to less service uptake of adults. So again, when we think about balancing economic costs, where should we be investing our money? I still would contend it has to start with the parenting. And I also think it's really important that we remember it's not just about the parents. They are operating in this system that is influencing them. And I think a lot about the parents that I'm working with in West Philadelphia and the many, many challenges that they're facing in their own lives, how that might intersect with their parenting. So when we think about making these changes, we need to be thinking about that broader framework, the broader systems that could be changed, and the policies that could influence that. And, I think that there are inevitably short-term political and policy constraints that stand in the way of these important long-term changes that I think would have a huge impact at a societal level, but we don't yet have the motivation to get there. I think biology can help with that. I think neuroscience can help with that, because I think that that is language that policymakers and politicians respond to. So for people, for me, I really care about making this difference. And I think I really want to think about ways that I can responsibly use the neuroscience work to make policymakers pay attention and make changes that will bring about changes in some of these things and improve the well-being of children and families. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like I've talked way too long, and I apologize for how long I've gone on. Thank you again to all the people who have made it really fun for me to do science, I guess, and contribute to this work. And thank you to all of you for attending.